Today, we're diving into a Supreme Court case, Santos versus Reyes, that really gets to the core of a super important question. When you go into business with someone, are you a partner or are you just an employee? As we're about to see, getting that definition right can mean the difference between a massive payout and, well, nothing.
So, here's how we're going to break it down. We'll follow the classic case digest format, looking at the facts, the legal issues, the court's ruling, the reasoning behind it, and, of course, the final order.
All right, let's start at the beginning. Let's get the facts straight. This whole thing kicked off back in June of 1986. You have Fernando Santos, who was the money guy, and Sps Reyes, who handled the day-to-day operations of a new lending business they started.
And things moved fast. By August, they even put it all in writing with an article of agreement. But believe it or not, less than a year later, the whole thing just fell apart. It ended with Santos suing the Reyeses, claiming they stole a bunch of money.
This is where you get two completely different versions of reality. On one side, you've got Santos saying, hey, the Reyeses were just my employees, and by the way, they took over 1.5 million pesos from me. But on the other side, the Reyeses are saying, no way, we were partners, we brought our skills to the table, and this lawsuit is just his scheme to avoid paying us our fair share of the profits.
So this huge disagreement landed in court, and the judges had to sort through three critical questions.
First, and this is the big one, what was the actual nature of their relationship? Were they partners, or were they just employees? Everything else really hinges on the answer to this one question.
Second, the court had to follow the money. Was there any actual proof that Sps Reyes took funds that were supposed to be for client commissions, or was this accusation just made up?
And third, let's say they were partners. Were they actually entitled to a slice of the profits? And if so, how in the world do you calculate what they're owed?
So how did the courts rule on all this? Well, the journey through the legal system is pretty interesting. At first, it looked like a total slam dunk for the Reyeses.
The trial court said, yep, they're partners, and awarded them millions. The Court of Appeals totally agreed. But then it got to the Supreme Court, and their decision was a lot more nuanced. They said the petition was only partly meritorious, and that meant nobody was walking away completely satisfied.
And that brings us to the ratio decidendi. It's just a fancy legal term for the core reasoning behind a court's decision. So let's dig into the why. Why did the Supreme Court rule the way it did?
On that first big question, were they partners? The court's logic was actually pretty simple. They basically said, just read the contract you all signed.
Right there, in their own agreement, it explicitly laid out a profit-sharing plan, a 70-15-15 split. Legally speaking, an agreement to share profits is like the textbook definition of a partnership. So that pretty much sank Santos's claim that they were just employees.
Okay, so what about the accusation of theft? Well, the court found Santos's story to be, let's just say, illogical. It just didn't make any practical sense.
Honestly, his evidence was incredibly weak. The court found that Sps' signatures were just to acknowledge she received documents, not that she received cash. A key piece of evidence was even found to be a forgery. And a supposed $200,000 cash handoff, there was no voucher, no receipt, nothing to back it up.
But here's the major plot twist. The lower courts had ordered Santos to pay the Reyes a share of this absolutely massive number, over 20 million pesos, which they called total income. And that, it turns out, was a huge, huge mistake.
You see, the problem was that the lower courts calculated the shares based on the total gross income, basically all the money that came in the door. They totally forgot to subtract all the business expenses, like the money that was loaned out in the first place. The Supreme Court had to step in and say, hold on, you can only share the net profit, what's left over after you pay the bills.
So what are the big legal lessons, the doctrines, that we can pull from this whole mess? Let's get into it.
It all comes back to this fundamental definition from the Civil Code. A partnership is when people agree to contribute either money, property, or their industry, their actual work, to a common business, all with the goal of splitting the profits. The Reyeses contributed their work, and the contract showed they intended to split the profits. It's a textbook case.
And this case gives us a super important clarification, especially for what are called industrial partners, the people who bring their skills and labor to the table, not just cash. Their share must be based on net profit. You take all the money that comes in, subtract all the expenses, and whatever is left over, that's what gets divided. You never, ever base it on the gross amount.
This all leads us to the disposition, the court's final order. So after all the arguments, all the back and forth, what was the final outcome for everyone involved?
The Supreme Court's order was really a mixed bag. First, they affirmed, yes, a partnership did exist. Second, they affirmed the dismissal of the theft complaint. But third, they reversed that massive multi-million peso award. And finally, they ordered the whole case to go back so a proper accounting of the partnership's net profits could finally be done.
So in the end, the petition was partly granted. The Reyeses won the moral victory. The court agreed they were partners. But their big payday was put on ice. No money was going to change hands until the proper accounting figured out what, if anything, was actually left to share.
You know, this case is really a powerful cautionary tale. It leaves us with this final thought. How much pain could have been avoided here? How can clear, written agreements and really careful accounting stop a promising business from turning into a total legal nightmare? Because at the end of the day, that paperwork isn't just paperwork. It's the very thing that can save a partnership from destroying itself.